If you had to describe the details of what happens in your mind when you're just sitting around, how good would you be at it? Does paying attention to what's happening in your thoughts change your thoughts? How do we build language about our interior life when much of it doesn't have any words at all? What does this have to do with getting surprised by a random beep and immediately writing down what you're thinking? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and author at Stanford, and in these episodes, we sail deeply into our 3-pound universe to understand why and how our lives look the way they do. Today's episode is about what you can know about your inner life. Now, you may know that I wrote my book Incognito about the giant swirling river happening under the hood, all of the things that your brain is doing that the conscious you has no access to and no awareness of. Most of the action is happening down at that level. But we do have conscious thought. Think of that like the surface of that swirling river. That's your inner thoughts. But the really weird part is you're generally not very good at describing your inner thoughts. In other words, we might think, oh yeah, I know what my conscious experience is. I have an inner voice and I narrate what I'm going to do next. And sometimes I feel happy or sad. But the issue we're going to dive into today is that your insight into your own conscious experience is shockingly bad. And we're going to see a way that this can be studied and made better. So let's start here. If you had to describe the world around you, you could point to the things that you see. There's buildings, there's trees, there's a bicyclist. You could measure distances, you could measure temperatures, how much things weigh, and you can put together a detailed and accurate account of the world around you. But the other world we inhabit is our inner cosmos, the world inside. So think about the swirl of thoughts that drifts through your mind while you're driving, or the inner voice that narrates your day. Sometimes it's encouraging, sometimes critical. Or think about the images that flash by when you're lost in a memory, or the sense of anticipation when you're waiting for something to happen, and maybe this has no words associated with it. This inner world is arguably just as important as the outer world. It's where our emotions are felt and our plans are born. And yet, despite its centrality, despite the fact that we each live inside this private theater of experience, it's really hard to nail down. We don't understand it nearly as well as we think we do. Now, why not? Well, part of the challenge is that the inner world is very fleeting. A thought appears for you and then it morphs and then it's gone before you can catch it. Or an emotion wells up and fades before you even find a word for it. So most of the time, we move through our days immersed in this invisible river of experience without even realizing it's there. We are like fish in water, surrounded by it, but unable to describe it because we've never seen anything else. Now, imagine you're a scientist and you want to study this inner world. You want to take conscious experience, not as an abstract idea, but as something that can be studied. Now, how would you do it? We have a few tools like fMRI or EEG, but these don't allow you to actually put a thought under the microscope. You can't weigh a feeling on a scale. You can't take a snapshot of a passing daydream. So maybe what you would do instead is just try to get people to pay attention to their inner life and describe it. But the difficulty there is that when a person tries to pay attention to their inner life, that changes it. The rawness of experience gets replaced with their ideas about experience. Maybe memories get polished, or gaps get filled in, or stories get invented. So if you truly wanted to study conscious experience, the real messy, flickering reality of it, you would need a new kind of method, one that doesn't assume it already knows what's happening inside, one that doesn't force people's minds into neat categories, one that finds a way to respect the fluid and delicate and often unexpected nature of inner life. And that brings us to today's guest, Russell Hurlburt. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Russell has spent decades wrestling with exactly these questions, and he developed a technique to get at the details of people's moment-to-moment experience as faithfully as possible. He's worked for a long time to turn the mysterious territory of consciousness into something we can actually explore. So in our conversation today, we'll talk about what kinds of inner experiences people really have, why our intuitions about our own minds are often wrong, and why our inner world is richer and stranger and more surprising than we usually imagine. Here's my conversation with Russell Hurlburt. Okay, Russ, so before we get into your contributions and trying to understand internal experience, I want to understand how people were thinking about the world when you were a young student. So if I'm correct, you once met B.F. Skinner. What was that like, and what was his view on private subjective experience?
Well, that's a great question because I consider Skinner one of my significant ancestors, I guess you could say. So, and I would say it's an important question because you have to understand what I think Skinner thought and what I think everybody else thinks that Skinner thought. And those are very different things. What everybody else thinks that Skinner thought was that nobody had inner experience and the world was a black box or something. And what was interesting was behavior, things that you could measure. And external behavior. But that isn't what Skinner wrote, and it isn't what he said, and it isn't what he believed, but that's what a lot of people think that he said. What he actually believed was that inner experience was there. You experience things like hot and pain and visual stuff. That stuff is there. But he said it's very difficult to scientifically deal with that stuff because the language that you use to describe inner experience is not well differentiated. And that was one of his main contributions, one of the main things that drives my research.
What did he mean is not well differentiated?
So, for example, you have a blue background going on right now, and we can have a conversation where we can be very careful about what color that blue is. It's not navy blue. It's sort of like sky blue. It's not turquoise blue. It is sort of azure. Maybe it's not azure. We can refine our language about that quite effectively. Exterior language. But if I say I'm feeling blue and George says he's feeling blue and Doug says he's feeling blue, well, there's no guarantee at all that those mean the same thing. And we cannot present a different blue to me, a different inner blue to me, and the same inner blue to Doug, and thereby figure out what the language is. So you cannot differentiate the language, Skinner said. And I think he was sort of half right about that. I think the language is not well differentiated in general, but I think you can differentiate it. So that's maybe where Skinner and I depart. So we're in basic agreement that people's language about their inner experience is not to be trusted. Where we differ is, he said, well, let's just not deal with that. Let's look at external behavior. And I say, well, let's just try to differentiate and do the best we can and figure out ways that we can become confident about the language that we use. And up to the extent that we can do that. The other thing that Skinner said that was important and that I totally agree with is that he was entirely opposed to mentalistic explanations of behavior. So things like I eat because I'm hungry, the because I'm hungry portion is a mentalistic explanation. And he said, mentalisms are bad science because you can't measure hunger directly. If you try to measure hunger directly, even in rats, you can measure hunger by saying, well, it's been a month since I've given him anything to eat, or this is the amount of shock that he would endure to eat, or this is the amount of quinine that I can put into his pellets, and they'll still eat him. All those things are sort of measures of hunger, but they don't correlate very well with each other. And so there isn't a state of hunger that drives that stuff, he would say. And I totally agree with that. And so my research is not mentalistic. I try to describe things that are directly apprehended. They're private, yes, but they're not mentalisms. They're directly apprehended experiences. So that's a long conversation about Skinner. But Skinner was right about almost everything. But the path that he took was entirely behavioristic, whereas the path that I take is to say, well, let's do the best we can about inner experience.
So tell us what you mean exactly by something being apprehended.
Well, the work that I do is I generally give people a beeper. And a beeper has an earphone, and it delivers a beep at a random time. And I am interested in what is ongoing before the footlights of your consciousness at the moment of that beep. And what I mean by directly apprehended is it has to be absolutely ongoing for you right then, not 10 seconds before, not in general, but at the moment it has to be happening for you. So, for example, if you were speaking to yourself at the moment of the beep, and I was saying I should get a hamburger, if the words, quote, I should get a hamburger are there, then I would call that directly apprehended. But if I was sort of somehow hungry, maybe, and we were planning on going to lunch, and but that would not necessarily be apprehended. It would be a fact of the universe that I'm about to go get a hamburger, but it wouldn't be directly present to me.
Okay, so you know that people have these kind of experiences, but your contribution was developing this new method to study that. So what did you do with the beeper to get at experience in a way that people could tell you what they were apprehending at that moment?
So the method is very simple. I give you a beeper. I ask you what's going on at the moment that was going on in your experience, caught in flight by the beep. That's all I do.
So really. The beep goes off at a random time. The person
Correct.
Doesn't know that it's going to happen, and suddenly beep. What were you thinking right then?
That's right. And that seems like a very simple question. And much of sort of modern experiential science believes that people can answer that question. I personally don't think people can answer that question without some training. So when I do that kind of a study, so I give you a beeper and I tell me what was in your experience at the moment of the beep, and then come back and tell me about that. Well, later that day or tomorrow, maybe within a relatively short time, we'll have a conversation about that. And when we have that conversation, it'll turn out that you won't be telling me about things that were going on at the moment of the beep. You'll be telling me about things that happened last week, or things that I was startled by the beep. That would be after the moment of the beep, or things that you think happen in general. Well, I always do this, or I never do that, or whatever. And we would have a conversation in which I would say, well, it might be true that you almost always do that, but let's let the study demonstrate that. Don't tell me what you always do. Just tell me what was happening at this particular moment. And you would say, if you're a typical participant in my research, you would say, oh yeah, you're right about that. That really wasn't there. So I'll try to do better next time. And so next time you would presumably be somewhat better at it, or you might be somewhat better at it. And we would have another conversation where I would shape your ability to what I call cleave to experience and cleave to the moment of the beep. But let's zero in just on that time, let's set aside everything else and just take a look at that particular moment as if that was interesting enough.
So this is how descriptive experience sampling differs from other introspective methods, because you're saying, what are you feeling right now? And you have this surprising beep that goes off, surprising in time, and it doesn't sound like other things. It doesn't sound like your phone or other beeps that you're used to. And so people have to say, what was I doing internally just then? And so what sorts of answers did you discover?
Well, what I would consider sort of my main contribution is that people, don't know what the characteristics of their own inner experience are. People are very often entirely mistaken about that. So, for example, a lot of people come into my studies, saying, well, you're going to find that I talk to myself a lot, because everybody talks to themselves a lot, and I talk to myself a lot. And many of the people who leave my studies leave saying, well, I thought I was going to talk to myself, but it turns out I don't talk to myself hardly ever. And that is not at all uncommon. People are sometimes often dramatically mistaken, particularly about things like inner speech. People think that inner speech occurs. As a matter of fact, inner speaking, I prefer to call it inner speaking rather than inner speech, because it's more a verb than it is a thing. It's an action that I'm taking. So I think inner speaking is a more descriptive deal. And some people do talk innerly. So they will be saying, I'm going to go get a hamburger, unquote. And that gets caught in flight by the beep.
And so when you started collecting these detailed reports, it sounds like you were surprised by it, but I imagine the people themselves were surprised. Did it change their notion of who they were in some sense?
Yes. So the method is, you're going to wear the beeper, we're going to talk about it. Then you're going to wear the beeper again, and we're going to talk about it again. And then we're going to wear the beeper, and we're going to talk about it again. And then you're going to do it again. And you're going to get better at that each time. And I'm going to get better at understanding what to ask you. This is the characteristic of my method that I call iterative. We're going to get better and better at it as we progress. And that is really what makes my research different from most other people's research. The fact that I don't think you're going to be good at it on the first day, but I think that we can get better at it on the second day, and even better at it on the third day, and even better at it, which means I think that Skinner was right. You're not going to be good at it. Your language is going to be crappy at it on the first day, but we can learn how to talk about it by confronting or considering a series of your experiences over the course of several days of conversation.
So what did you find? What were the most common types of inner experience that people have?
Well, I sometimes refer to what I call the 5 FP, or 5 frequent phenomena, which are inner speaking. People do talk to themselves sometimes. Inner seeing, most people call that seeing an image. I think there's a lot of reasons not to call it that, but people have visual imagery, and that's 2. The third is sensory awareness. Sensory awareness is, I'm interested in some particularly sensory aspect for its own sake. Like, we're having this conversation, and I could be drawn to the blue of your background, not because the blue is important to me or important to our conversation or relevant to our conversation, but for whatever reason, I'm interested in the blue of the background. That's sensory awareness from my point of view. Then the 4th is feelings. People do experience emotions from time to time. And the 5th, I call unsymbolized thinking. And by unsymbolized thinking, I mean I experience myself to be thinking about something, and it's directly before the footlights of my consciousness thinking, but there's no words and no pictures and no imagery or whatever. So I could be thinking, well, let's go have a hamburger. No, I think I'll have a hot dog. Something that would be that explicit, hamburgers, hot dogs, but without the words hamburger or hot dog, and no picture of a hamburger, and no smell of a hamburger, and no anything about a hamburger, except that I recognize myself to be contradicting my original thought about a hamburger and changing my mind to a hot dog.
And how common is the unsymbolized thinking? And is this different from person to person?
All of the 5 FP, all are common. And by common, I mean across all of my samples, they occur a quarter or a third of the time. And you can have more than one at a time, so the numbers don't have to add up to 1. But they're all common, and the frequency varies from 0 to 100% within people. So people are hugely different. There are some people who do innerly speak almost all the time, and others who never innerly speak, and some who have visual imagery all the time, and some who never do, and everywhere in between. So people are very different about that.
This list of 5 frequent phenomena, this is not exhaustive, right? There are other phenomena that people experience?
Absolutely. I don't want us to think that there's these 5 things that you can do, and that's all you got. You're going to take this one off the shelf and do that, and you're going to take inner speaking off the shelf and do that. That's not the way it is. What I think is that there are enough people who describe a phenomenon where they are engaged in some kind of speaking with themselves that we might as well give it a name and call it the same thing across people. And that would be inner speaking. But there's all kinds of variations, both within the 5 categories that I've ticked off there, and others. So you can, inner speaking, for example, has as its neighbors inner hearing. You can hear your own voice rather than speak it. And that's a very different phenomenon, actually, as different as speaking into a tape recorder or hearing your voice come back out of a tape recorder. Same words, same voice, whatever, but the experience is dramatically different. And inner speaking takes place sometimes with entire sentences and sometimes with sort of a shorthand version of sentences. There are some theorists who think that all inner speaking is a condensed thing, but that's not true. It's actually more common, from my point of view, and more complete sentences than condensed. And sometimes words are present and sometimes they're missing, and you can have the experience of speaking without any words at all, or this all manner of alternatives.
And this question comes back to what you said about training people iteratively to do this, but I can imagine, it feels to me that with unsymbolized thinking, people would often feel like they need to describe that as inner speech. They might confuse those. Do you see that happening? Let's say I'm imagining the hamburger and the hot dog, and you say, what were you thinking just then? And I might put it into speech, even if it wasn't actually how I experienced it.
That's what generally happens. So the typical pattern is that somebody says, I talk to myself all the time. And so I said, well, that may very well be true, but let's discover that. So and the first beat was, you would say, I was saying to myself, I should go have a hamburger. And I said, well, what exactly were the words that you were saying? And you would say, I think I'd like to have a hamburger. And I would point out, well, those are not exactly the same words. The first set of words was, I should go get a hamburger. And the other one was, I would like to have a hamburger. Those are not exactly the same words. And I'm interested in words. So if you have words, I'd like to know exactly what those words are. And you would say, oh, that seems fair. If I'm saying what the words are, I'll tell him that. And then the second day, you would come back and say, I was saying to myself that I should turn up the thermostat. And I would say, well, what are you saying to yourself? And you would say, well, the room was cold. And so I think I was saying to myself that I should put it up to 76 degrees. And I would say, well, 76 degrees is a little bit different from I'm being cold. And what were those words? And then on the third day, you would come back and you would say, I've been telling you all these things about words, but they're not really words. But it takes 3 days or 4 or 5 of careful interviewing before the typical person can say, well, there really weren't words there. People have the notion, what I call the presupposition, that words are present. And I would say that my technique was never, well, I don't believe you when you say you had words there. Tell me about it. What I said instead was, you tell me what the words were. I'd like to know exactly what those words were. I was always in favor of your telling me about the words. You, because you're an honest broker, as most people really are down deep, would think of that as a reasonable question and try to do it. And you would discover for yourself, no, there weren't really words there. So I feel like an innocent observer in that regard.
I know some researchers are skeptical about the reliability of the reports of inner experiences. So how do you defend against that?
So I think everybody is justifiably skeptical about reports about inner experience. And I would say I think you should not think of the results of my studies as being reports of inner experience. They are descriptions of inner experience that have been generated by the participant and me together. That is not a report. It's a big difference from my point of view, because most of psychology is based on reports. We get a report from you and that's it. The subject is down the road, and then we try to analyze this kind of a report. I think that's bad science. I don't do that. What I do instead is you give me a report that said, I was thinking I should have a hamburger. And I said, well, let's flesh that out. Let's see whether we can get a description about that. It turns out to be a bad description. The second day, you'll give me another report. And I'll say, well, let's flesh that out. That turns out to be a bad description too. The third day, you give me another report. But together, we can make that into a description that I think is believable. But it's a first-person plural exercise. It is not a first-person singular exercise.
Got it. And what you're really shooting for here is what you call pristine inner experience. Tell us what you mean by that.
By pristine, I mean naturally occurring in your natural environment. So I want to know what David's experience was like when he's doing whatever it is that David's doing. If he's doing an interview, I would like to know what his experience is like doing an interview. If he's driving to the grocery store, I'd like to know what's happening in the grocery store. That's what I mean by pristine. In your natural environment, unaltered by the intentions or whatever. So I use pristine in the same way that you would talk about a forest being pristine. That before there's an asphalt walkway and before the plastic bags and before the road signs and all the other traffic.
And this is how you differentiate it from other psychology experiments where someone comes into the lab, they do a report of some sort and they leave. Just so we're clear here, how often were these beeps and they were going off just during somebody's day, right, as they were proceeding through life?
What I found is that in an hour, which is a pretty long time for interpersonal reaction, interpersonal relationships. So in an hour, we can talk about a half a dozen beeps. And so I ask you to collect a half a dozen beeps. And I generally set the beepers so that it's random with an average time in between beeps of a half an hour. Okay. So you're going to wear the beeper for 3 or 4 hours. You're going to get a half a dozen beeps. And then we're going to talk about those half a dozen beeps. And then you're going to wear the beeper again tomorrow or next week or whatever for another 3 or 4 hours and get another half a dozen beeps.
And the idea is that I wear that at home while I'm going about my life?
If you're at home or if you're at work or if you're at the grocery store or whatever. I don't have a rule about how you do that. But what generally happens is that people will say, after they've done it for a few days, well, I really ought to wear it when I'm doing this kind of behavior, because when I'm engaged in that activity, maybe my thinking is different, and we should try that. And I would say, well, that sounds like a good idea.
And just remind us, when the beep goes off, does the person immediately stop what they're doing and write it down or record it?
Yes. So your task, you're wearing the beeper, you're going about your everyday life. This is a beeper, it has an earphone in it. You put an earphone in and put this in your pocket and go about your everyday life. And when it beeps, you suspend whatever it is that you were doing, freeze your inner experience enough so that you can jot down some notes about it. And then generally the best way to do it is to jot down notes in a notebook. But your task is to jot down notes enough so that then we can talk about it and you can remember what that particular experience was about. I don't look at your notes. The notes are between you and you so that you can do a good job of describing your experience.
Are there things about inner experience that science is not able to measure?
Yes. So the work that I do, I try to get what I call a high fidelity description of inner experience, but it's short of perfection. I strive for perfection and fall short all the time. But I think there's a pretty big difference between somebody saying to themselves, I should go have a hamburger, and somebody else having a visual imagery of a hamburger. There's very little confusion about that if people are actually saying it and people are actually seeing it. If they're not, then, if you've got some theory about the way consciousness is and how hamburgers present themselves in consciousness, then those things are hard to tease apart.
Could we use descriptive experience sampling to help people become more aware of their own mental patterns in, let's say, therapy or mindfulness? Is there a way that if you had a more realistic insight into your own thought processes, into your own inner experience, that would help you in some way?
I think the answer to that is definitely yes.
Why?
The typical person who finishes my study says that's the best therapy I've ever had, and a lot of them have had a lot of therapy. But and the interesting thing about it is that that what we did was never anything other than tell me about what was in your experience at the moment of the beep. We never tried to fix you or try to.
Why do they say that's the best therapy? What's their experience?
Because they now feel themselves to be less delusional than they were before.
Ah, great.
I think the oracle is right, and know yourself is an important deal.
Have you ever made a phone app that allows people to do this at scale?
I have a phone app that I have made, but it isn't good enough. Sooner or later, I will build a beeper that would be easily available. But it's not just the beeper. It's the beeper along with somebody who is skilled at helping you, what I call bracket your presuppositions. So you have presuppositions about I'm an inner speaker, say. And my technique, what I call bracketing presuppositions, is well, let's just set that aside. Maybe you are an inner speaker, maybe you're not an inner speaker. Let's find out. That's the bracketing technique. That is a non-trivial skill. If you believed yourself incorrectly to be an inner speaker and you wore a beeper until the cows came home, you would end up believing yourself to be an inner speaker, because at every beep you would say, well, this is what I was saying to myself. And then the next beep I was saying to myself. And at the next beep I was saying to myself. You need a skilled interlocutor who can ask questions that help you overcome your own presuppositions. It's my job as an interviewer is to try to pay attention to where it looks like you're describing experience and where it looks like you're not describing experience, and help you get from one to the other.
I agree. I do wonder in this era of incredible AI whether we could get that to bracket presuppositions almost as well as the human does.
I doubt it, but I've been mistaken about these things before, so I don't really know.
What can your work tell us about somebody, let's say, with depression?
I think a good exploration of experience in depression would be valuable. And I've done a little bit of it, but let me tell you just like one example of a person who was a cyclothymic kind of person, so was depressed today and up tomorrow and down the next day and then up or whatever. And what I found was that their inner experience was very different on those days. So when they were down on a depressed day, they had a lot of what I would call unsymbolized thinking. And when they had an up day, they had a lot of what I would call visual inner seeing. And the interesting thing that I would like to tell you about that is that when they were down, they knew themselves to be down, but they didn't know themselves to be absent of visual imagery. Yeah. And when they were up, they knew themselves to be up, but they didn't say, well, when I'm up, I have visual imagery, and when I'm down, I don't have visual imagery. That came from the exploration. So people's inner experience, I think, is directly connected to something. Whether it's the inner experience causes it, or whether it's a result of it, or whether it is an epiphenomenon, I don't know the answer to that. I think you need a lot of people out there like me doing this kind of work. But what that example says is you can't expect a person to be able to tell you what the important things are, because they just don't know.
Have you ever tried this, let's say, with somebody with schizophrenia?
Yes. My first book actually was about schizophrenia, which is a small sample of schizophrenics. But what I found was that there was quite a bit of visual imagery involved schizophrenics, and that visual imagery was very often what one of my participants called goofed up, which I came to adopt as a technical term for myself. So a goofed up, so first off, a normal image, a non-schizophrenic image, is not seeing an image. It is an inner seeing. So I prefer to call it inner seeing. And so if you're not schizophrenic and you have an inner visual phenomenon, it's pretty much like having an external vision for most people, which is to say the center of it is sort of more detailed and it disappears off at the edges, which means it's not like looking at a photograph with a border and an edge to it. My schizophrenic subjects, their inner seeing was like seeing an image. And the image, which is to say what they saw, had characteristics of an image. It did have a border. And that border could be very arbitrary, like the border could be like that. Or the image could have spots on it, like somebody had taken a toothbrush with ink on it and spattered the image. And that spattering is on the image. It's not on the face of the guy. It's on the image of the guy. Or the image would float away, so they see it like this, and then they see it sort of curl up and disappear. That is not what normal people do. So that is part of the reason why I'm fairly sensitive when people say I was seeing an image. I think it's true that schizophrenic individuals, at least some schizophrenic individuals, see an image, whereas most normal people don't, and it's a hugely different deal.
Yeah,
which is unknown to most of experiential science, which to me is you have to pay attention closely, because if you let somebody tell you, well, I'm seeing an image, then you lost the game. Schizophrenics are often given credits for having blunted affect, which the business means they don't really experience any emotions. And what I found was that my schizophrenic participants, at least some of my schizophrenics, had what I would characterize as hyper clear affect. And so they would say I was angry, and that anger was a teardrop shape in my chest, and it was sort of this wide here, and then it got wider, and it was a half an inch below my chest here and 2 inches thick down here. That is not the way most non-schizophrenic people talk about their inner experience. But schizophrenics have learned not to talk like that. And so they, as a general rule, they don't tell you about that aspect of their experience. And so it looks from the outside like their feelings are blunted. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there's a lot to be learned from knowing something about somebody's inner experience, the way their inner experience actually is. But to do that, you have to go through 3 or 4 days worth of iterative training. And most psychology is one-shot deal. The irony there is that in my work, I throw out the first day or two of descriptive experience sampling work results all the time, because I'm sure that people don't know what they're talking about. Most of the rest of the science all they do is look at what I would call the first or second day of stuff. So they look into what I think is just absolutely not worth much.
Last question. If I understand correctly, you started descriptive experience sampling 50 years ago. Is that correct?
That's true.
Okay, so where do you think it's going to be in 50 years from now?
I think about that. Sometimes I think I'm 50 years out of date, and sometimes I think I'm 50 years ahead of the game. I think inner experience is vitally important, and I think the oracles were right. Know thyself is an important deal. And I think that's at the heart of almost every thoughtful tradition. People want to know themselves. And I think we've sort of fallen away from that. AI is sort of the maximally falling away from that, leaving that behind. Whether we can transcend that and figure out how to get back to inner experience the way inner experience is actually experienced before we destroy ourselves through some other method, I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question.
Talking with Russell Hurlburt reminds us of something that's easy to forget. The most familiar things in our lives, our own thoughts and feelings and sensations, are in many ways still unexplored territory. We move through our days surrounded by the chatter of inner speech and flashes of imagery and the subtle currents of emotion, but we rarely pause to look carefully. We rarely ask what is actually happening inside me right now. We rarely recognize how much is there. And when we do turn our attention inward, it's easy to bring with us a set of assumptions that we're constantly narrating our lives in full sentences, that our thoughts are always well-formed and logical and coherent, that we already know what it feels like to be ourselves. But as Russell's work shows, The reality of inner experience is typically messier and stranger than the stories that we tell about it. Some moments are rich with inner speech, others unfold in pure, wordless awareness. Some thoughts flash by without any verbal or visual form at all. Sometimes what seems central to us, like emotions, barely register at all in a given moment. And other times, a sensory awareness or maybe unsymbolized thinking or a subtle feeling, these are the things that take center stage. So what Russell is offering isn't just a scientific method, it's an invitation to approach our own experience with the same curiosity, the same openness that a scientist brings to a new and unfamiliar landscape, to bracket our expectations, to listen carefully, to resist the urge to simplify or categorize too quickly, and maybe even to be surprised by what we find. Inner experience is not just an echo of the outside world, it is its own territory. It's complex and dynamic, and it's worth studying, not just scientifically, but personally, because in the end, understanding our conscious lives is not just an academic exercise, it's you. It's what you've got going on in there. So you may as well figure out what it is. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope today's episode will give you a little window into the extraordinary and often overlooked cosmos inside of us all. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Check out my newsletter on Substack and be a part of the online chats there. Or you can send me an email at podcast@eagleman.com with questions or discussion. Finally, you can watch the videos of Inner Cosmos on YouTube where you can leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and we are catching glimpses of the inner cosmos.